Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. Okay, this is Olivia Wilkinson with the Joint Learning Initiative. Um, we're just 1 minute past the hour, so I think we're going to start and get going. So welcome everyone. There'll be a few more participants joining it as we go along. If you could, while you're not speaking, mute your microphone, that would be great. So today we're hearing presentations focusing around the theme of the role of local faith actors in refugee response. We'll be hearing a series of presentations from myself, but also in conjunction with Amanda Rives Argeñal, who's at World Vision, on the Faith Action for Children on the Move forum that's just happened, and the work that we did around that connected to some evidence for faith action for children on the move. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Aleksandra Milovanović, who is a fellow at KAICIID, and she'll be talking about the role of local faith actors in refugee response in Eastern Europe. So I think that if you want to introduce yourself on the chat, there's a little button below. Stacey, would I hand over to you? Stacey's our knowledge manager at JLI, to do any housekeeping about the technical side of things, please.
Great. Thanks, Olivia. Just to let everyone know, this webinar is being recorded, so if you do not want to be recorded, just keep your microphone muted the entire time. We'll be sharing the webinar recording on the JLI and social media platforms as soon as we can after the webinar ends. And just a few pointers on Zoom. If you move your mouse in the Zoom screen, you'll be able to find the menu bar that'll pop up usually on the bottom of the screen in black, and you can click on the little text bubble to chat with everyone or specific webinar attendees. Also, at any point, please feel free to use the buttons that you see. I believe it's on the right of your screen, so you can raise your hand or tell a speaker whether you can hear them or not. And as the webinar progresses, if you have any questions, please feel free to send those to us through the chat, or you can also send those to me or Olivia directly. And I'll just hand it back over to Olivia.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. So I think that the order that we're going to go in first is that we're going to present about the Faith Action for Children on the Move side of things. The way that we've got this set up is to have Amanda present a little bit on the background to the Faith Action for Children on the Move. I'll speak a little bit more about the evidence, and then Amanda will tell us about some of the actions that they have going forward from this. So to briefly introduce myself and Amanda, as I said, my name is Olivia Wilkinson, and I am the Director for Research at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. So I was leading on the evidence side of things of the Faith Action for Children on the Move work that was done. And then otherwise, so Stacey, I can see you're going to Amanda's profile there, and then I'll introduce Amanda. She's the external engagement advisor. Oh, the screen's slightly flicking about there, Stacey. Amanda's the external engagement advisor at World Vision International. So I think what we're going to do now is we'll hand over to Amanda to start off the presentation on Faith Action for Children on the Move. So Amanda, over to you.
Got it. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Stacey. Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Could we put my slides up, Stacey, if that's okay? Maybe I'll just run through that first. Okay, so right. World Vision for quite a few years has been working with a number of faith partners. Obviously, we work at lots of different levels, locally, nationally, internationally. But when we launched our It Takes a World campaign to end violence against children, we began to work very intentionally together with global faith actors at that international level. In 2018, when we began to think what our focus was going to be for this year, many of our partners were working on migration and refugee issues, given that the negotiations were ongoing for the two global compacts on migration and refugee issues that had come out of the New York Declaration. And so we decided to pivot and focus the theme of violence against children to violence against children on the move for 2018, with a strong belief that as faith actors, we were in a unique position to influence the dialogue and the discourse and work on this together. Thank you. So the International Organizing Committee, you can see that there, the list of members. I see many of you on the call today, so please feel free to compliment and add to the presentation from your perspectives. This list grew a bit as the initiative really took off. We also had an international advisory committee of different UN agencies and mandates. The Office of Marta Santos Pais, the Special Representative to the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, her office was especially active. UNICEF came on board, UNHCR came on board a bit later. Aza Karam was especially helpful. But the reason we created a committee was that their role was a little bit different, and we wanted to break them out and have the space, keep the space dedicated to faith-based organizations. Next slide. On the next slide, you'll see that we also had a host committee in Italy that grew to a number of organizations. And these organizations, by and large, are faith-based or faith-inspired or actual religious congregations that were providing support to refugee and migrant children that are arriving in Italy. And I think we probably couldn't have picked a more politically complex context to be working on these issues. So it was very challenging for these organizations to break out the time to work with us on the concepts and on the program, because they were so active and engaged in responding to children's needs, as well as dealing with the fluctuating political context. But that actually, I believe, enriched very much the dialogue and the outcomes of the forum at the same time. Next slide. We had at the forum itself, leading up to the forum, I mean, I've showed you the list of organizations, but broadly over the 8 or 9 months prior to the forum itself, which was held on October 16th, 17th, and 18th of this year, we had engagement of over 60 organizations who participated in WebExes and discussions and pre-workshops in Geneva, Rome, and New York. And at the forum itself, we ended up with over 85 leaders originating from 38 countries, representing 85 countries. We had a very busy, active schedule with 91 different speakers in different capacities. And the draft action plan that we went into the forum with was stewarded and refined by an action plan committee, which was rightly chaired by Jean Duff, who many of you know. Next slide, please. Our forum objectives, so the first one that we'd set out was to be able to compile and analyze the response, program approaches, best practices, policy frameworks, etc. We wanted this to be evidence-based, and that's where we turned to JLI and their expertise, who conducted a literature review, which then became the series of learning briefs, which Olivia will talk about in more depth, so I'll skip over that. But the process building up to the forum and in itself, we also built in time for discernment and dialogue and consensus building amongst the partners and different communities working on the issues. We wanted to have the high-level action plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we'll also shortly be releasing the publication that really outlines the whole process and the outcomes, so that others who were not part of the process can carry it forward as well. So the evidence base, and I don't want to steal Olivia's presentation, but you'll learn that a literature review that they worked on with inputs from many partners, and from a review of the existing evidence, as well as some preliminary work that we did with partners, sitting down with multi-sectoral groups that pulled together policy folks, humanitarian folks, development folks, religious leaders. And we began to draft out a plan. So the three themes that evolved from that simultaneous literature review and the dialogue and discussion work were spiritual support to children and caregivers as a source of healing and resilience, strengthening the continuum of protection, and building peaceful societies and combating xenophobia. Next slide. So the action plan that was endorsed by the conference participants, we had a draft going into it. And as I mentioned, it was actively refined and reflected on, and that was stewarded by the action plan committee during the forum, is quite a dense document. And I would hate to do it injustice here, but I probably will by just throwing up some bullet points to give you a flavor of what the action plan includes right now. And let me preface that by saying it is still open for review. This is something that we would very much like your eyes on and your comments. We want to, we're open for comments until I think November 30th, so just a few more days. But it begins with a set of principles around shared beliefs, affirmations. We certainly focus on the rights-based approach and frameworks, the commitments that we have that are particular to the sector that we're working in and the context, a principle of religious respect and the diversity of our beliefs, and builds on key processes such as the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and the compact work, and a number of other global, legal, international kinds of frameworks. And of course, child protection and safeguarding, as well as child participation, are strongly acknowledged as pieces that we want to strengthen through this work. So the first theme, that providing spiritual support to children, families, and caregivers as a source of healing and resilience, it really recognizes that this kind of support is effective and that it should be promoted and that we should do more of it. That's essentially what it's saying. And I think for some of the more faith-focused groups, that was not surprising or necessarily different or innovative. But when we talk to the UN system actors, the humanitarian sector, that is a bit novel and different. And I think that this particular piece was an especially unique contribution to the discussion between faith actors working at all points of the spectrum between humanitarian development and spiritual work. And then, of course, this connects with the kind of psychosocial, mental health, and resilience programs that we engage in, that we want to see more of. We have mentioned there that we need more faith-sensitive guidance and resources, the kinds of frameworks that there are, be they minimum standards, also need a faith lens on it. And another potentially innovative piece that might not come out elsewhere is the need for safe spaces for worship for children on the move. I think that's especially true when we're operating in a camp-based setting or in a host community where migrants and refugees might be of a different faith. So the next slide, please. And I'll just speed it up here very quickly. The second point, the strengthening the continuum of care for child protection. Faith actors play a role in that system in lots of different areas. It's informal and formal actors. You see there all the kinds of services that we really tried to break out, and the cross-referencing and interconnectedness with health, ECD, education services that faith actors play such a strong role in. Different phases and stages of children's journey, and the connections to broader systems and systems reform. The third piece was the special role that faith actors need to play in sensitization, awareness, building bridges, all of the bad things that happen to children that aren't physical violence, but certainly have a long-lasting impact on their development, and the role that churches have to play in that. The next slide, please. So I think Olivia will talk about this as well, but I can't stress enough that the literature review and the learning briefs that were produced were so key to this process. It gave us something so significant to really look at and discern and contribute to. I don't think we would have gotten as far in the process and the action plan had we not done that groundwork with JLI and with many of you on the call to really set a strong foundation. The fact that the forum and the action plan itself was very action oriented, excuse my redundancy, was very highly valued by partners and the advisory committee members. It was, I think, something that was unique, that this wasn't just a conference where we were talking about issues, but we produced something that should continue to guide our efforts internally as well as externally. It also gives us something to connect further with local partners, smaller networks, other networks, and to influence decision makers. And then just the last slide. So the next steps, we're focusing on the action plan. Certainly, we're looking at those 3 areas. Different organizations are likely going to take leadership roles and participation roles in those 3 themes. I don't think that the work on those themes is completely done. There's still space and need to continue to discuss and refine and see what other tools do we need, what other research do we need to do. But there's also a strong acknowledgement that we need to take this outside of our community and take it outwards. So there's working together, and then we're looking at committees on advocacy, on outreach, development of different kinds of communications materials and programmatic guides where we've seen gaps through this process. Resource development. We'll be creating a terms of reference as well, hopefully as a resource site for this initiative. For now, everything's up on the JLI website. They've been very, very kind and gracious, and we've been using their site to promote this initiative. So you'll find everything there. And I'm sure this presentation will be circulated on the last slide. On the last slide, I have links as well to all of the important pieces there. So I think I'll stop now and turn it back to Olivia, maybe to turn back to the evidence.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Okay, so Stacey, if we can go to the next slide. Yes. Oh, the first one there. I think it's, yes, that's great. Okay, so as Amanda was saying, we went through a process before the forum, right at the beginning of this year, where we wanted to make sure that the forum was grounded in, had a good evidence base, that the forum wasn't going to reinvent the wheel per se, so that we weren't going to just discuss what was already known and not really be able to move forward past just establishing what was out there. So we did this piece of work that was, if we can go to the next slide, please, Stacey. Apologies as well, my next door neighbours have decided to do their hoovering and cleaning at this moment in time, so apologies if there's any background noise there. We made sure that evidence was the foundation of the forum. And this means that we were looking at the faith response to children on the move as the orienting concept for our literature review and case study work that we did. A little bit of background that you'll probably know already, but the current estimate is that of all of the refugees in the world, the majority are under 18. And so therefore, in terms of migration and in an even bigger picture, 1 in 8 children in the world are the migrants, according to UNICEF. And so for the purposes of this research, we did take a relatively inclusive picture of who would be involved as children on the move. And that's all children who migrated across borders or been forcibly displaced across borders or within the borders of their own country. And those are the 3 learning briefs that you can see at the bottom. We will be able to share links to those briefs as well. But I will now describe a little bit of what's in them just for your information. So this is the background and the method that we took to do this initial review. It was based on a standard systematic review of the literature, but that included academic and grey literature. So we were also interested in materials produced by NGOs and other organisations. We reviewed 222 resources of these varieties in total. And then the other thing that we did is that we opened up an online case study submission platform. And the reason why we did that was because we were very aware that a lot of material and information would be out there from different partners around the world, including faith actors who are just working in a specific location, who want to present their case study of the work that they're doing, but haven't yet published it as a finding as a report, or had a piece of academic research done about the work. So we wanted to make sure that we were opening the review to information from outside just these standard areas of publication. So we had this online case study submission platform, and we received 33 submissions in total, of which we were able to use 21. The exclusion criteria, just to get to those 21, were based usually on the amount of information that was included in the case studies and the relevance to the work that we were trying to do. We can go to the next slide there, please. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the learning brief. Of our 3 learning briefs, is the learning brief on spiritual support. And these are the main areas that we found were of interest from the literature and what we were seeing in the case studies. I think that some of the points will not be particularly surprising, that spirituality supports resilience during experience of displacement. But the things that we want to get into a little bit more, for example, are the fact that spiritual support and psychosocial support can be and should be mutually beneficial when responding for children on the move. And so this is an important point, because I think at times what we saw that the psychosocial support and spiritual support were quite separate. We've recently seen the publication of a set of faith-sensitive guidelines for psychosocial support and humanitarian response that was written in collaboration between Islamic Relief Worldwide and LWF, Lutheran World Federation. And so that's an initial start. And I think that the next stage now is to ask, well, what are the faith-sensitive guidelines that we need for that's specifically for children, and how can we adapt that for the experiences and the particular experiences of children in displacement? And one of the things that we thought was particularly interesting, or that we found from the literature, are actually those 2 points at the bottom of this slide. Well, first of all, that with children, that creative expressions for recovery were particularly influential and meaningful. So times where children are allowed to play and create as part of the their spiritual support, we found interesting examples of how that had been successful. And then also that the advantage for spiritual support is that it often looks to the whole family, including parents and caregivers. So it's not just a response for children, but it's understanding the environment that they live in, and that within the whole life cycle, the response for their parents can be just as important and needs to be combined with the support for children as well. We also saw that the physical space created in places of worship, for example, was an important safe space for children's recovery. There was an interesting example from the response to the Rohingya in Bangladesh, where children in a report by Save the Children, Plan and World Vision, children described how they, the sounds of the call to prayer and the practice of being in and around the mosque was a safe space for them, as it gave them time to be with their family and feel connected to their identity. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Stacey. The example that I'm going to bring out here is the experience of trauma healing. This is an example that was submitted by the Church of the Brethren on their Healing Hearts curriculum. So I don't know if anyone's on the call from that organisation, but thank you for your submission. the trauma healing curriculums have become quite widespread and common, and that's one of the main ways in which we were seeing faith communities responding with psychosocial assistance for children on the move. This particular trauma healing program, the Healing Hearts curriculum, included these trainings, and then they did a second training for an interfaith curriculum. And the interesting point for us here is that there was this adaptation. So the last point on the slide here, you can see that originally it was a Bible-based curriculum with Bible stories. But then trainers working with Christian and Muslim communities requested the adaptation towards an interfaith version, and that adaptation took place. So I think that what we really need to underline here is that the importance of ensuring that assistance is relevant and appropriate, and understanding the particular needs of that community. In this case, that meant that it was an interfaith presentation of the trauma healing. It wasn't that faith should be, removed from the trauma healing completely. It was that grounding, that faith grounding, was important, but it needed to reflect the interfaith nature of the groups of people that were present during the training. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Stacey. Right, so the next area we looked at was the continuum of child protection. I'm going to start to move through these a little bit faster for time, but I would add that this is all in our learning briefs that are published online, so you can read these whenever you want. And I think that for child protection, we looked at this in terms of both prevention and response. Again, we saw, for example, the importance of including caregivers, working within the physical spaces that are provided by religious institutions, such as the fact that non-formal education is provided in some of those environments. And then the role of leaders within faith communities in various ways in order to mediate, but also have systems for reporting and referral, and filling in the gaps where response mechanisms that should be in place for child protection are not in place. And so we saw that the religious leaders can be key local stakeholders in refugee camps for this kind of action. Yes, thank you, Stacey. We'll go to the next slide there. So I think that this might be an example that people are familiar with, but the example that we have here is Amparo, accompanying migrant minors with protection, advocacy, representation and opportunities from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So this is for children on the move in the Northern Triangle, Mexico and the United States. And the interesting thing here is that it's the church network, the religious network, that serves to allow this program to operate across the different stages of displacement and spaces of displacement that children on the move experience. So this includes accompaniment, mobilizing churches across these different countries, so that this is underlining the idea of the continuum of child protection, that as children move, religious networks can provide that protection from place to place because of this networked nature of their involvement with each other and the overarching networks to which they belong. So this included helping children with families in the US find appropriate legal representation, urging congregations to become safe places and gathering places, but then also including within this types of advocacy and awareness building. It's not simply the action to accompany children on the move, but to create the political space and the social space and cultural space for children to be safe and protected as they move, which includes awareness building and advocacy work. Okay, so next slide, please. So the final area that we looked at was peaceful societies and combating xenophobia. The findings, again, perhaps not completely surprising, but that faith actors influence attitudes and behaviours. but the role that that can therefore play in combating xenophobia, addressing the root causes that might lead to migration and children being on the move, addressing the causes of discrimination when children arrive in their places of either settlement or transit. I think that we found that this issue of awareness raising and advocacy also came through very strongly in this area. This included religious leaders speaking out, various awareness raising campaigns, and faith actors advocating to policymakers at the highest level for the protection of children on the move. In terms of combating xenophobia, this went from the very immediate and physical protection of people on the move against xenophobic attacks by faith actors to a broader cultural shifts that can be led in part by religious leaders for combating discrimination towards religious minorities and educating next generations to prevent xenophobia. So this relates to this next slide. I'm just taking the example here. Again, many of you might know from Arigato International, their Learning to Live Together program that is an intercultural and interfaith program for ethics education. The example that we looked at here was particularly from the work that they did in Greece. And they implemented the program with 5th grade students in an elementary school. It's about being playful and creative and finding space to tackle some of these potentially awkward issues around xenophobia and racism that children experience in the playground and can lead to discrimination and bullying. The students that were involved were from 10 different countries and sometimes didn't even speak the same language during the program. And so they used various methods, including cooperation-based and problem-solving-based learning, and had a playful and creative environment, as I said before, in which to implement this program. So there's a full report that can be found on their research into this program, and it's also in our learning brief. I'm trying to move relatively quickly, but I think that is the end of the presentation right now. I would encourage you to go and look at the learning briefs because that is where we can see the details of all these different findings that I haven't been able to go into in too much depth here. But I think what we're going to do now is we're going to have the opportunity to hand over to Aleksandra. And Aleksandra is going to be able to report in much more detail about her work looking into local faith community action for refugee response in Eastern Europe. And so this is now the opportunity to kind of take it down from our much higher level of reviewing all the evidence globally about faith action for children on the move, and hand over to the work that Aleksandra's been doing as part and during her KAICIID fellowship has been the work that she's been doing. So Aleksandra, I will just quickly introduce you. She's an anthropologist and a research fellow at the Institute for Balkan Studies in the Serbian Academy of Science and Arts, and as I said, a KAICIID fellow. So Aleksandra, please, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm just trying to share my screen, if it's possible. Yes. Okay, hope this is working. Hello, everybody. As Olivia already mentioned, now we will move a bit more into regional perspective of Eastern Europe, mostly focusing on my latest research results on the case of faith-based organizations and their response to migration crisis in Serbia. As you can see here, my presentation will focus, as I told you, on the topics and method and goals of the research we conducted in 2017, and it is still ongoing. I would also like to point out more on the experience of migration in the context of the Balkan route and dynamic of migration in the last 3 years. That is quite specific for this area of Europe. And then at the end, I would speak about the role of faith faith-based organizations in a response to migration crisis. So basically, in this presentation today, I will speak about the role of humanitarian faith-based organizations in supporting migrants in Serbia. Organizations included in the research are associated with churches and religious communities that have been active for many years and that have active base of believers in Serbia and network of churches across its territory, working with refugees and asylum seekers and having humanitarian programs that support migrants. I will end my talk with some conclusions on the place of faith-based organizations and their possible impact on migration policies, as well as their multi-religious response to current migration developments. The research I am talking about today is actually a part of research project Forced Migration, Religious Diplomacy, and Human Security in Eastern Orthodox World that is conducted within the program of the University of Aston from Birmingham in 2017, and it is still ongoing. I have been conducting this research together with my colleague Marta Stojić-Mitrović, also from Belgrade. And we have included several organizations from Serbia conducting qualitative semi-structured interviews with representatives of key faith-based organizations and churches in Serbia, namely Philanthropy, which is the organization of the Serbian Orthodox Church, following with Caritas Serbia and Catholic Relief Services within the Roman Catholic Church, and JLI-KAICIID as organization of the Islamic Community of Serbia, as well as ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency in Serbia. In addition to the interviews we have conducted, we also used online data, including reports on migration in Serbia published by international and national organizations such as UNHCR and others. The decision to focus on the 5 religious communities and faith-based organizations was mainly due to their continuous presence in this area of Europe and their influence in supporting migrants from 2015. As you have probably already know, Balkan countries are part of the Balkan route, which came into the headlines and media only recently in 2015. However, the Balkan route connecting Asia Minor and Central Europe has been an old migratory path, with migration taking different forms in the course of time, following border changes, interstate relations, alliances, and different shifts in terms of changing national state borders in the history. During the 1990s, as you may know, and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the civil war that was taking place in this part of Europe, Serbia became a host country for more than 500,000 of persons that came from other Yugoslav republics. These processes have placed Serbia into quite dynamic migration situation since it hosted a large number of displaced persons and the experience of migration that will further have a significant impact also on the current migration situation in Serbia. So in 2015, as you can see, the Balkan countries were on the main migration route to other European countries, and Serbia as non-EU country, as a pre-accessing country, had a different regulations in terms of openness and closeness of the borders. That will also lead to a significant shift in the Balkan route in 2018. So the number of migrants and the manner of transiting through the territory of Serbia has significantly changed since 2008. The year 2008 is taken as a beginning since the national asylum system based on the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Protection of Refugees came into force, and Serbia began using concepts and mechanisms of migration control that is based on EU legislation and administration. So the topic of transit migration was underrepresented in mass media until 2011, when the first presence of people transiting the country became visible to the general public. Attitudes to migration in countries across Europe, as we know, have differed. Reasons are complex and often contextually specific. In the case of Serbia, the large numbers of displaced people and urgent humanitarian needs pushed the state to establish a specialized national institution, the Commissariat for Refugees and Migration, in charge of distributing aid and organizing the admission of people fleeing conflicts. So you can see here on this picture how the number of people entering country changed actually from 2015, when we had 8,000 people entering in just one day. In March 2016, when the Balkan corridor was closed, 2,000 persons were stuck initially, and it came up to 10,000 of persons. In January 2017, we had like almost 2,000 persons sleeping in the Belgrade city center only. We're not speaking about the whole country. So it was a situation that was quite complex in terms of managing the number of people that were entering Serbia and staying in Serbia due to closing of EU borders with Hungary and Croatia. So basically, the country of Serbia was in that moment in very difficult situation of how to engage and how to distribute humanitarian assistance, but also how to accommodate and register all of these people who are settled into different areas of the country. The number of asylum seekers in Serbia that are now, as I told you, 3,000 people that are now staying in Serbia is the official number in the official camps. However, there are many illegal migrants that are not registered in official camps that are living outside of these settlements. However, the number of those who want to ask asylum in Serbia is quite low because Serbia is perceived as a transit country. However, people usually spend several months waiting for the approval to go further to European countries or their desired destinations. And some even wait up to 2 years to continue journey. This was significantly changed after 2016 when people were not able to move further and were in some terms stuck into borders of Serbia. The state opened new reception centers in different parts of Serbia, so they have like 18 operating refugee camps that are existing. Now I would like to focus more on the activities and why faith and where is the place of faith-based organizations in the whole system of quite complex situation with migrants and refugees in Serbia. I would like to emphasize that the response of faith-based organizations is connected to their experiences with previous refugee crises in this part of Europe. As I told you, during the 1990s and the civil war in this area, the activities of faith-based organizations actually started. Most of the organizations we were conducting our research with were actually establishing in 1990s and starting their first humanitarian aid programs to refugees and internally displaced people, victims of wars in Yugoslavia. In course of time, they also involved other vulnerable groups, especially Roma population. What was the advantage of faith-based organization was the access, especially those internationally, with international outreach, such as Caritas, ADRA, or CRS, was their possibility to use financial sources quite promptly. Other NGOs and other faith-based organizations have a much slower response mechanism and cannot react immediately. In general, the lack of organized and coordinated response on the arrival of large numbers of people in Serbia was evident from very early stage. From spring 2015, actually the state with the institution began to gradually build more organized response. The Commissariat for Refugees and Migrations actually called faith-based organizations for a meeting, inviting them to start and to initiate their collaboration, having experience with migrants and refugees from the past, using these capacities to start working together on the first steps with current migration situation. And one of the first organizations, grassroots organizations that initiated this humanitarian activities was the Philanthropy organization that exists within the Serbian Orthodox Church. As you may know, the Serbian Orthodox Church is a predominant confession in Serbia. More than 85% of people in Serbia are declaring themselves to be Serbian Orthodox. Having parishes through the whole country, it was very easy for this organization to start with different projects for migrants and refugees coming from Bulgaria or from the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, from the south of the country, establishing various types of aid, especially in the food, clothes, medical aid, etc. Faith-based organizations have been vital for functioning of the organized migrant support in Serbia, since they provided the daily needs for migrants regarding food, clothes, education, entertainment, legal aid, and sanitation. As migrants have begun to remain in Serbia for longer periods of time, organizations started to become involved in other types of activities, such as enrollment of children in elementary schools, language courses, or organizing various social or educational events. After the images of Belgrade city center with a huge number of migrants staying outside without any kind of shelter spread in media around the world, the International Caritas Network of Caritas Europe and Caritas Internationalis became interested in the situation in Serbia. So these two organizations within the Roman Catholic Church started and initiated very significant activities that affected and enrolled migrants and refugees in Serbia, together with Red Cross. That was the only institution at the beginning delegated by the state to be responsible for migrants and refugees. Alongside the Catholic organizations, there was one Muslim organization that also was included and even collaborated with Catholic Relief Services in distribution of food especially for Muslim believers. It is an organization of Islamic Community of Serbia called JLI-KAICIID. It is a very small grassroots organization that was established in 1923. So it is basically the oldest organization that existed among Muslims in this part of Europe. JLI-KAICIID actually first started to work with migrants even in 2011, when the first migrants from Tunisia came to the mosque to sleep there. And also to the building of Islamic faculty behind the mosque. Even though the financial means of this organization is quite small, they managed to gather women of Belgrade and distribute dry food during the week or on the holidays, especially Fridays after the prayer in the mosque. They cooked meals and provided shelter also for refugees. Another important faith-based organization that was involved in the humanitarian aid system in Serbia, ADRA, as one of the 130 national offices. ADRA was also active for a long time here, from 1990s. And during the wars in Yugoslavia, ADRA played a significant role in humanitarian relief in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was interesting that ADRA was not perceived as a church or organization that belongs to any national community. It was international, transnational. And if some organizations like Catholic Church or Serbian Orthodox Church or even Islamic community could not enter I'm speaking about the war times, some communities to provide aid, ADRA was perceived as the only organization they could, for example, trust, in terms that they do not affiliate themselves with any particular national group. ADRA had a significant role in what we call integration or inclusion of migrants, even for a short period of time, because ADRA established a community center in the outskirts of Belgrade in 2017, having various activities that go beyond this first emergency response of food and clothes and medical aid. So ADRA was the first faith-based organization that actually started programs that included taking children to school, for example, providing buses, providing for women different courses or workshops. So people that stay into the neighboring camp where this house is can spend some quality time, especially men playing sports and women learning maybe some new skills. So ADRA was the first community to establish such a house for this use. ADRA also emphasized very often that the mission of their society or their organization is, as in Psalm 146, they said, the Lord protects the strangers, he supports the fatherless. So from this first aspect that people associate faith-based organizations to the aspect of mercy, most of the organizations emphasize that the vulnerable groups are a matter of social justice, while human rights are something that must be protected and strengthened. So they're not giving mercy to these people, they're trying to act on a humanitarian level and perceive them as equal members of the society. As Jesuit Refugee Service, we haven't done extensive research with this organization, but we're planning to continue because they are especially involved with the protection of unaccompanied minors, having a special house built for more than 20 children living here in Belgrade. So their activities were mostly involved with working with children, which is also one of the specific aspects of this organization. While, as I told you, while philanthropy and JLI-KAICIID are nationally oriented organizations, we had Caritas, Catholic Relief Services, ADRA, that have a strong international outreach and benefit from global transnational networks, but also having impact on the grassroots level. Thus, their aid system functions differently, especially in so-called migration emergency relief. The official discourse on transit migration in Serbia underwent significant changes from 2015 to 2016. In the beginning, in 2015, we had this humanitarian discourse. It depicted transit migrants as vulnerable persons in need to immediate humanitarian assistance, in a kind of empathy that was frequently evoked by referring to the experience of Serbian refugees in the 1990s. However, in 2016, the perception changed, especially with the issuing of the European migration policy, and the new aspect of more securitarian approach to migration and the closure of the corridor and the Balkan route. This new approach to migrants especially was quite visible in preventing illegal border crossing. We had a stricter control on migration movement, trend of putting together all the migrants into the state-run camps, and solidarity practices. For example, in 2016, the state asked all faith-based organizations and as well as other civil society organizations to stop distributing any kind of humanitarian aid outside the state-run camps, so that doesn't create a kind of parallel humanitarian aid system. State discourses which are presenting Serbia only as a transit state, resulting in threatening migration as temporarily emergency-like phenomenon. However, migrants now stay in Serbia for longer periods of time, and integration will inevitably have to take place. The closure of borders resulted in the unwanted state of migrants in Serbia. They regard their stay in Serbia as temporarily and hopefully brief. So it has been very difficult even for various organizations with numerous programs to inspire them in a way not only to follow the standard asylum procedure, but also to join activities, to start education, to start learning languages, or other activities. And faith-based organizations took part in these activities significantly. The major impact was taking children to the school and learning Serbian and English or German, depending on their choice, as well as including children and teenagers in various educational programs. And also what is interesting is that migration crisis that was occurring in the past years led to collaboration between faith-based organizations that traditionally worked one alongside the other. So basically, to conclude, in relation to other organizations, what we wanted to see is what is the advantage in terms of being a faith-based organization, and how the special role of this organization is actually visible. One of the advantages is the opportunity for action where other organizations encounter obstacles, which is related also to special position of this organization within the wider society. And their way of treating migrants as part of existing society, not as part of something that is alienated or brought from abroad, or foreign or external. So in a way of transgressing negative stereotypes especially towards Muslim migrants in a predominantly Christian environment. But also possibility of a joint collaboration between faith-based organizations is quite a big advantage, because together in a kind of multi-religious response, faith-based organizations are able to create more effective responses and possible programs for inclusion of migrants and refugees. However, unlike their social unlike their other social organizations, faith-based organizations do not advance direct policy influence. Maybe this is their minus, although they work close with state structures, faith-based organizations, and their voices in terms of building new policies and recommendations is quite limited here in Eastern Europe in general, and restricted to an operational nature, namely supporting state authorities which have the final word on refugee policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. So we're coming up close to the hour, and I know that people will have to drop off. We will, if you have a bit of time, we'll extend for another 5 or 10 minutes to allow for some questions. But before you have to go, if people are dropping off soon, we'd like to remind you that you are welcome to become a member of the Joint Learning Initiative to find out more about the resources and virtual learning hubs that we have, where we can discuss more about research on religion and development, and you'll find all the information at JLI-FLC.com. And we'll also remind you that for anyone who's interested in refugee response in particular, we're going to be having another meeting of the Refugee and Forced Migration Hub on the 10th of December. Otherwise, I will now hand over for questions. If there's anyone that would have questions, either please type them in the group chat, or you can raise your hand to let me know that you have a question, and then I will happily open the floor to any questions. Any questions?
Hi.
Please don't be shy.
Olivia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sorry, I was typing it, but I wasn't typing it quick enough. Aleksandra, I was just curious what the reaction of the FBOs was when the state said that there was not to be any support for refugees outside of state facilities in Serbia. I mean, did they have a discussion? We've seen this happen elsewhere where the FBOs don't necessarily identify the group that they're serving as refugees per se, but as needy people in their community.
Yeah. It was a quite big event in 2016 when the Commissariat said that there should be no organization providing aid outside the camps, because camps have their own regulation and restrictions for entering, of course, and you cannot enter the refugee camp if you are not having a permission to do that. So then faith-based organizations had to struggle in a way, not to struggle, but had to ask for these permissions. And once they were in, they were just, you know, transforming kind of, or moving from the streets or from other locations to providing aid in refugee camps. But it was different because they could not react so promptly, for example, to help somebody, because they were also providing not only this first aid assistance, but also legal assistance, for example, help translations. That was important. Actually, they were providing anything people would need. And in the camps, of course, these things could be limited. So what we noticed is their presence in camps is a little bit more or less visible now, especially after 2016. Before that, they were more active and more free. Actually, there was freedom in communication and in contact with migrants and refugees. However, migrants are not in prison. I mean, they can leave refugee camps. They are, you know, coming and going. So they could visit, for example, Adra has this community center as a house very close to one of the refugee camps in Belgrade. So they could freely come there. So there is a contact still, but it is not the same as it was before the state issued this new kind of statement that there should not be a parallel system of humanitarian aid developing outside the knowledge of the state.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Bonnie. Is there a means of developing a network so that FBOs are able to make contact when they know a family or individual is moving on, or simply to share information? I guess I'll put that back to Amanda and Aleksandra if you have anything you'd like.
Well, I mean, networks would be useful, especially in the local level, to connect organizations, especially those who are not collaborating often. But what we have seen so far in our research is that faith-based organization in current migration situation in the Balkans started spontaneously to collaborate, to communicate, and to help each other, which was not the case in previous situations of emergency, not only related to migrants and refugees, but we also had some natural disasters like floods in 2014, when also humanitarian assistance was needed, and some faith-based organizations initiated collaboration. But now we see that there is more effectiveness in their mutual work. So I guess that for some future action, especially related to policy and some advocacy related, is necessary to establish a kind of network and to connect people working in faith-based organizations, not only in Serbia, but across the region, especially in the neighboring countries, especially in Bosnia and Croatia, where now migration path takes place through Bosnia mostly, and through this kind of joint collaboration that could be that we would have a more effective results and more effective policy, I guess.
I would add on that as well that I think in some of our broader research, not just with Children on the Move, but more generally on refugee response, that we've also seen that networks do exist. They're often relatively informal, and it's based on personal connections from place to place. So there'll be experiences of people recommending, for example, that they know someone in a church in this next place, and then that will influence a family's decision to move on to that next place because of those connections. So there's that informal level at which these networks are happening. But then there's also a role in place very much for the overarching umbrella type bodies and network type bodies to take up this role and actually do more on this as well, as we've seen with the example the Evangelical Lutheran Church with their Amparo work. So it's not always the case that those networks that exist are stepping into this role and helping to ensure the continuum of protection, but there are some good examples where that has happened, and I would further encourage such networks to see their role in such activities. Amanda, anything there?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I mean, I think that was certainly one of our intentions with the Faith Action for Children on the Move forum, to help strengthen networks that exist, to create them when they aren't there yet. You're certainly right, Olivia, that lots of times people are networked informally, but the patterns of migration and internal displacement are happening so quickly and in such fluid manners that they might not be connected with the people that they need to be. And that's where the interfaith nature of this kind of work can be especially useful. I was just speaking today with a group of Filipino faith-based organizations who are responding to internally based populations within the Philippines, Christian organizations responding to children on the move from predominantly Muslim contexts of the conflict that many of you know well of. And they had a need to make those connections with their Muslim colleagues to better understand the needs of the children coming into their areas. And so that's something that we certainly talked about at the forum quite a bit, and that is hopefully well reflected in the action plan, and something that we'd like to take forward more in our work together.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. I think we're about to get to 10 minutes past the hour, so I want to thank you for your time and allowing us to go a little bit over to have some time for questions there as well. I'd remind you that you should please look at the action plan that's open for comments at the moment, and Stacey has put that in a link to that on the chat for everyone to look at, the action plan for the Faith Action for Children on the Move. Otherwise, we'd encourage you to look at our learning briefs and resources around that, and please follow up with us if you want to ask more, perhaps of Aleksandra or any one of the presenters today. So thank you very much, everyone. Stacey, I think that's it from everyone. Do you have anything else to add before we close?